There's a connection. Sacramento. Getting the tie with that one? Kind of like sacrament. Holy place. Another great connection with Jesus. Each place seemed to have this desire to make sure that we remembered Jesus' influence. In fact, our entire calendar is based upon this man, Jesus. Now, some could say, well, yeah, but his followers really wanted that to happen. Really? Not really. Jesus really cared very little about time. He really cared very little about renaming how and when things took place. Remember how they describe his birth? In the days of Tiberius. Pretty much everything in the New Testament is timed by somebody else's name, by somebody else's time, by somebody else's accomplishments. And yet here we are 2,000 years later, and we measure time by how far we are from Jesus' death and birth. Now, if that's not enough, if you walk through a cemetery, you discover there's all kinds of headstones. There in the cemetery, even the simplest headstone has one thing on it consistently. What is that? The date, right? Has two dates. The date of our birth, the date of our death. And then there's a dash in between. You know what that's for? How long we occupied this earth and how far the distance from Jesus' birth. Even that is marked in terms of this man, Jesus. And cemetery. Cemetery comes from the Latin, which means place of rest. It wasn't where we buried the dead. It was where we rested until we arose again. It wasn't until after the time of Christ that we actually started burying people as a commonplace. Up until that time, bodies were disposed of elsewise. So all of these things begin to point back to this man, Jesus. Now, this time of year, it's very easy to see the influence that Jesus had in our culture. Okay, there's one thing that stands out with Thanksgiving, besides the turkey, besides the family, besides the food. Every year, at this time of the year, there's one event that happens consistently, and that is, it begins the season of hearing what? Christmas carols. We've been singing songs to Jesus since the time of Paul, when Paul sang of his praises. All the way up through, I guess, the newest contribution to that collection, Justin Bieber's Under the Mistletoe. All of those things are pointing to this man Jesus, whether they are religious or not. Isn't that amazing? Now, people proclaim all of the good deeds that Muhammad did, but usually only if you're a Muslim. They talk about the things that Buddha did, but generally only if you're Buddhist. But in our world that is very influenced by celebrity and notoriety, the most famous person in all of history, the most influential person of all of history is this man, Jesus. So again, who is he? Who do you say that he is? Well, some say that he was a bit deranged. He had visions of grandeur. We know what that's like. Hitler had those, right? Stalin had those. Others have had these vast visions of grandeur, thinking that they were going to be the world's ruler. But not Jesus. Jesus came and he said, my kingdom is not of this world. He didn't ever proclaim himself to be king of all the earth. He said, I am the one from heaven. Jesus was not the demented one. But very often, if someone is checked into an asylum or a place for mental illness and they want to check whether or not they are themselves demented, they ask them the date. They ask them where you're living. They ask them who the president is. And they ask them who they are. And very often, you'll find that those with severe mental illness will say, well, I am Jesus Christ. Why would that be? Here you have, once again, this influence that's come through all of history. Even those who are mentally struggling believe that Jesus Christ is that standard by which we measure all other things. But maybe Jesus was just a fraud. Maybe he never really did all of the things that he said he could do. Maybe his disciples made up all of it. Maybe he was just a Pied Piper for the blind. We have others in our culture who believe exactly that. Yet the Bible writes down over 36 different miracles that Jesus performed. Now we could say, well, one miracle, that's a nice trick. After all, when Moses went to Pharaoh, remember very often when God gave Moses something to do, Moses would do it, and his magicians would say, well, that's a nice trick. I think I can do that. And they'd do it on a smaller scale. Nobody in history ever raised the dead except Jesus. Nobody could make those who from birth had been blind suddenly be able to see. Hadn't been able to get those who had been crippled for all of their life to be able to walk. All of these miracles are recorded, and they weren't recorded by Jesus. They weren't even, for the most part, originally recorded by his disciples. They were recorded by the people around them that took notice. How do we know that they took notice? Well, it says that sometimes he had thousands of people following him because they knew that he could do these various miracles. Was he a Pied Piper just for those who were blind to any other belief? Or as I believe it was Mark said, was it just an opiate of the people, something to keep them pacified? Well, you might initially believe that, and you might initially go out to see this Jesus, but would you keep returning day after day, month after month, year after year, following this man if there wasn't some truth in all of it? If you didn't see it for yourself? If he's saying that he can do these things, and his disciples say he can do these things, and yet he never does them in your sight, would you believe? It was around AD 120 when a historian by the name of Quadratus wrote to Emperor Hadrian that the works of the Savior were lasting, for they were genuine. Those who were healed and those who were raised from the dead were not merely while the Savior was on earth, but also after his death. And they were quite alive, some to the extent that they were even alive at that day. So even in AD 120, you have people who are eyewitnesses to all of this. They're not recounting something that they had heard about. They're recounting things that they had actually seen. And to many, they would answer that question, who do you say that Jesus is? By saying that he is our divine friend. He is the Savior, the Messiah, the Christ, the Holy One of God. I think it's interesting that Peter is the one who initially says that. Peter's the one who initially says pretty much everything. Good or bad, Peter's right there.